and welcome to our fourth season of Tuesdays With, sponsored by the Friends of the Georgetown Library. We're so glad you're able to join with us today virtually in our creative and safe approach to be able to continue our series of Tuesdays With. We've been doing it now, as I said, for 4 years. It's very exciting to be able to share great speakers on important topics with our Georgetown community. My name is Bob Willey, and I've had the privilege over the last several years of serving as president of the Friends of the Georgetown Library. And today my privilege to be able to share with you on this special occasion as we have our virtual Tuesdays With. The title of our series is based on a wonderful book that came out in 1997, Tuesdays with Maury, which speaks of a relationship between a student and a professor of lifelong learning. And that's the purpose of our series, is to be able to have this series of lectures that continue our learning ability regardless of our age, and to be able to continue on year after year. We're thankful you're able to be with us today. And I want to thank also Heather Pelham and Truman Wynn, who are providing the technology for us to be able to make this possible. It's a creative way, as I said, to be able to do our Tuesdays With series. Today we're privileged on our Tuesdays With to have Tuesdays with Ed Piotrowski. As many of you know, weatherman at WPDE, Channel 15 ABC in Myrtle Beach, and really pleased to be able to have him as a part of our lecture series, the start of this season. Ed was born in Hawaii, traveled throughout the South as a military kid with his father, who was a 30-year Marine, and we appreciate that so very, very much. Ended up doing his education at North Carolina State University, which was the closest institution to where his father was then based, and did a program in meteorology afterwards. Served an internship and then worked for a period of time in New Bern, North Carolina, and in 1994 transitioned to where he currently is. So he's been at Channel 15 for 26 years, I think that's correct. And really pleased with his wonderful contribution in meteorology, but also to the community, a great service-minded individual. This has been an extraordinary year for hurricanes. Together, we're all learning the Greek alphabet for the first time, or maybe for a second or third time, but it's an extraordinary year in hurricanes. And Ed's here to speak today on the topic of all you want to know about hurricanes. I don't think we'll be able to cover that within the period, but Ed, thanks so very much for your willingness to be able to be here with us today, and we look forward to hearing from you. Also, if you have any questions, you can type those in on the Facebook page there, and we'll have a time for questions when Ed has finished. Ed, at this point I usually say join me in welcoming, so we'll have to do a virtual tumultuous applause and welcoming Ed. Ed, thanks so very much.
Thank you, Bob. It's great to be here. Thank you all so very much, and hopefully you can see me fine. What I'm going to do right now is go ahead and share my screen and start my PowerPoint so that we can go ahead and get started on that. So everybody bear with me a second. And here we go. All right, perfect. Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and go on down the road here and talk about hurricanes. I'm going to get to everything that's happening this year in just a second, but for those of you that have been around a while, really the last 5 years have been pretty awful on the South Carolina coast because of tropical storms and hurricanes. Of course, 2 years ago, we had Hurricane Florence that produced a tremendous amount of flooding across the area. And the primary reason for that was because the system had moved so slowly across the area. A lot of people think that rainfall is basically dependent on how big a storm is, when it actually correlates with the speed of a system. So a tropical depression or a tropical storm can dump much more rain than a hurricane if it's moving slowly. You take a look at Florence. When it came through our area, it was only a tropical storm, but yet it produced a tremendous amount of rain. In fact, in the city of Loris, we had nearly 2 feet of rain just over a couple of days. That's almost half of what we get in an entire year. Georgetown was pretty lucky with less than 10 inches of rain. I mean, anytime you get 8, 9 inches of rain in a couple of days, that's a tremendous amount of rain, but it's all relative to a tropical system. So there was a ton of rain across our area. We set records. In fact, that 23.63 inches in Loris set the record for the most rainfall from a single tropical system in our state since 1950. And remember, it was only a tropical storm. correlates with the speed of the system, its forward motion, not so much the strength of a system. Hurricane Hugo is a great example. Category 4 blast through South Carolina back in 1989, but it only dumped 5 to 7 inches of rain because it was moving so fast across the state. All right, our rivers after Hurricane Florence also went to record levels, beating records that were set just 2 years prior when Hurricane Matthew came through. The Waccamaw, Conway, and Bucksport set records 3 feet higher than the record set 2 years prior to that. Staying with the Intracoastal Waterway, there obviously was a tremendous amount of concern for flooding along the Waccamaw all the way into Georgetown County. Thankfully, those floodwaters that were projected by some of the river forecast models never actually got to those levels, which was certainly good news. And as a lot of you know, in Georgetown, it's very low-lying land, and so that water spread out instead of going up, which was a very good thing overall. It could have been a whole lot worse. That was pretty bad flooding. Here's just an example of some of that flooding. This is in the Rosewood community near Socastee, and 3 out of the last 4 years, they actually had tremendous flooding because of all the rainfall that we've had. And this is the Intracoastal Waterway that actually flooded some of these homes nearly 7 feet. And, you know, everybody can hide from the wind, but it's incredibly difficult to hide from the water. It gets into every nook and cranny, and it pretty much destroys everything that it obviously engulfs, especially inside of a home. And it takes a tremendous amount of money to be able to recover from a flood of this magnitude. This is the city of Conway. The Riverwalk typically is not filled with a river. It's a nice concrete slab, but you can see how high that water got. I'm not 100% sure, but I think stop signs are about 8 or 9 feet tall. So you saw how high the water actually got there. And here's some more of the flooding out near the Conway area when Hurricane Florence came through. One of the things we always caution people about is to be very careful when you're traveling before, during, and after a hurricane. You know, the DOT does a great job of getting out there and making sure roads are safe, but they can't get to every one of them at a moment's notice. It takes time to get out there and assess the damage after or even during a hurricane. In this particular case, because of all the rain we had, this was a road in Horry County that was washed out by a small stream that became a raging river as it crossed the highway. And unfortunately, DOT was not able to get out there and see this before somebody actually drove through it. So one of the things we tell you is just to never drive before, during, or, you know, not necessarily before, but during and after a hurricane until the all clear is given because of situations like this. Thankfully, nobody was seriously hurt, and these people were able to walk away from what could have been a deadly accident because of floodwaters. Hurricane Florence killed 52 people, 40 of those in North Carolina, 9 in South Carolina, and 3 in Virginia. What is incredible to me is that there were more people killed after the hurricane than during the hurricane. Indirect fatalities include medical issues, auto accidents before or after the actual hurricane. Carbon monoxide poisoning is a big deal as well. Sometimes there's fires, and obviously electrocutions are possible when you have downed power lines. When it comes to direct fatalities, those related directly to the force of the hurricane, 18 or 75% of the people who died in fresh water. That means they drown in water often far from the coast. It doesn't have to be the storm surge. The storm surge is that mound of water that comes in with the hurricane that pushes the ocean ashore, but people do a pretty good job of getting away from the immediate coast. So we had no storm surge fatalities with Hurricane Florence back in 2018. But freshwater flooding, a really big deal. In our viewing area, which of course does include Horry, Georgetown counties, all the way out to the counties that border I-95, we had 5 people unfortunately perish. 2 died not far from Mullins, out near Nichols, where a law enforcement van was carrying 2 patients, and they went around a barricade and into rushing water. And unfortunately, the van flipped, and the 2 patients actually drowned. We had 2 people in the city of Loris that actually died because of carbon monoxide poisoning. So a lot of people have generators. It's important you never start your generator inside of your house, and not even in your garage. It needs to be very well ventilated and outside so that carbon monoxide does not come into your house. It's a silent killer, and unfortunately 2 people died there. One man was killed in Georgetown. He was crossing water on a road, and the water was very swift. It swept him off the road. Unfortunately, his truck overturned and he drowned and wasn't found till the next day. So you don't realize how powerful water is. It only takes about 6 inches to float your car and about a foot to wipe an SUV off the actual road itself. So Hurricane Florence was a big flood event. Also in 2018, we had Hurricane Michael. Michael was another powerful hurricane. And this time, it wasn't so much the rain with Michael. It was all about the storm surge and the incredible wind. It was a Category 5 hurricane when it eventually made landfall. The max winds were upgraded to 160 miles per hour. And that's where the eye came ashore between Panama City and Mexico Beach. Panama City was hammered, but Mexico Beach was on that right side, which is the most devastating part because it's the right side of the forward motion. So it came ashore and did a tremendous amount of damage. And here's just some video of the high wind. Obviously, they had some heavy rainfall, but relatively speaking, 5 or 6 inches of rain is not going to cause flooding. It was all about the storm surge and, of course, the high wind. And you can see what the high wind is doing here. Winds were gusting 100 to 150 miles per hour, taking roofs off of buildings and homes, bringing down trees and power lines. And then eventually here, you're going to see what looks like floodwaters from rain. And it's actually the Gulf of Mexico that was pushed ashore by the hurricane, what we call, of course, the storm surge. And that went several miles inland, inundating everything in its path. Now, this is after the hurricane had made landfall in the eye. And what you don't see are the massive waves that were generated by high wind as well. So those waves are often filled with debris, and they become battering rams and run into everything else. And the end result is what you're seeing here, what looks to be a 30-mile wide tornado coming ashore. It pretty much wiped the landscape clean of many buildings, including homes and businesses. Not every single home was destroyed, and that's a credit to how the buildings were actually built to be able to withstand a storm surge and the high wind as well. But that's just incredible when you look at that, how devastating the storm surge and wind can actually be near the immediate coast. And, you know, we say all the time along our coast, this is going to happen someday. It happened back in 1989 with Hugo, especially south of us. It happened in 1954 when Hurricane Hazel came ashore on October 15th of 1954. So history repeats itself with weather. Thankfully, this is rare, and hopefully it doesn't happen in our lifetime. But this will happen along our coast at some point in the future. We just don't know when it's going to happen. So last year we had Hurricane Dorian, which was a powerful Category 5 with 185 mile per hour winds over the Bahamas. Thankfully, by the time it reached our coast, it had weakened considerably, but that was the only hit we had last year. And, you know, Dorian compared to Matthew and Florence from 2016 and 2018 was actually a very well-behaved hurricane. It was a typical hurricane for our coast where it kind of brushes the coast, produces high wind and rain, but it moves on, and life, for the most part, got back to normal the very next day. And that's what happened a lot in the 1990s when we had hurricanes coming through. It's just that Matthew and Florence were incredibly slow movers that stuck around for days at a time and produced all the flooding that we actually saw. This is a radar presentation of Hurricane Dorian, and what really helped us, even though it was weakening, it was still a Category 2 as it passed by. If you look carefully, and I think you can see my cursor, there's the eye. This is going to roll again. The eye wall is the worst part of a hurricane. It has the most wind and the most rain. And when we roll this into motion, we had a lot of rain across our area, obviously, but here's the eye, and the eye wall itself, the eye wall stayed right off our coast. So we never got into the worst part of that hurricane as it moved off to the north and east. Yes, we had a lot of wind, and we had a lot of rain, and we had a storm surge, but Dorian could have been a lot worse as well if the eye had moved about 20 to 30 miles farther to the west. It was a very well-modeled hurricane. We actually did not believe we'd ever get into the eye of that hurricane because of what was expected to happen. So we were incredibly lucky when it came to that. Still, though, with that said, we did have a storm surge. This is down near Litchfield Beach, and the water, of course, coming ashore around high tide infiltrated a lot of the community of in and around Litchfield Beach, right on the coast there itself, and the water got into the streets. And this is only 2 to 4 feet of storm surge. You can only imagine how bad it would be if it was much higher than that. It was pretty nasty during Hurricane Matthew when we had 4 to 6 feet. And of course, during Hurricane Hugo, even Myrtle Beach had a 13-foot storm surge, and areas south had nearly a 15 to 17-foot storm surge, which was incredibly devastating. We also have to worry about tornadoes with tropical systems. This was a tornado that touched down in North Myrtle Beach the morning that Dorian was approaching our area. And typically with tropical systems, the tornadoes are fairly brief, but they can be highly damaging, as this one was. It did produce quite a bit of damage in a small area of North Myrtle Beach. Now, this one was on the ground for only about a minute to a minute and a half, but long enough to actually cause damage. And you can obviously see the funnel here, and it's picking up debris and basically sending that debris in many different directions. It's hitting other buildings and causing damage as well. But that's a classic signature of an actual tornado on the ground that was actually moving from east to west because of the circulation of the actual hurricane itself. Eventually, a police officer rolls up on this, kind of sees the fact that, hey, we've got a tornado here. I'm going to stop and just observe. And then eventually you're going to see the tornado actually lift. And what I mean by that is it goes back into the cloud, and you see a lot more light blue or light gray here, indicating that there's no longer a funnel on the ground. So that's happening about right in through there. So again, this was on the ground for only a minute to a minute and a half, but it did cause damage. Very much like the tornadoes that we had over the weekend. On Sunday, we had 3 very brief tornadoes touch down. One in north of Conway, one east of Conway, and out near Latta. All 3 of those did cause substantial damage in a very small area. But if you're in that small area, it can be devastating. Thankfully, nobody was killed. And nobody was killed with this by this tornado either. So we were lucky there. All right. So Hurricane Dorian also produced a lot of rain on the south end of the Strand. We had almost 15 inches, over 14 inches of rain in Litchfield, and a lot of rain elsewhere. But what made this one different is that when Matthew and Florence were coming ashore, we had a lot of rain leading up to those hurricanes. So the ground was already wet, and we had a lot of flooding, partly because the grounds were already saturated. Leading up to Hurricane Dorian, we were very, very dry, so that water had places to go without flooding communities. So for the most part, there was some minor flooding. We didn't have much flooding at all with Hurricane Dorian and no issues on our rivers. In terms of peak wind gusts, we had winds gusting in the 60s along the Grand Strand, generally in the 30s and 40s the farther inland you went. So 60-mile-per-hour winds is capable of damage. Really anything over 50 is. But the damage overall was minor because we did not have wind gusts in the 70s. So again, Dorian overall was not a horrible hurricane for us. Then, of course, this year we had to deal with Hurricane Isaias in the early part of August. And, you know, this was the one name on the list that I'm like, man, I hope this is not going to be a threat to us because I'm having trouble pronouncing this. And I had trouble pronouncing for the entire time that Isaias actually existed. Now that it's no longer a tropical system, I can say it flawlessly. But Isaias did come ashore near Ocean Isle with an 85 mile per hour winds. It was actually strengthening on approach to the North Carolina coast. And we actually did get into the eye wall of this storm. But here's the deal. You always want to be on the west side of any tropical system. Even if it's strong, it's not as strong as the east side. And here's the actual track of Hurricane Isaias into southeastern North Carolina, just to the east of Little River in North Myrtle Beach. Right along and east of the pass, they had winds gusting in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And as you saw, or I'm showing you now, we had wind gusts in the 40s and 50s on the west side of the tropical system. So we were very fortunate that this wasn't 10 or 15 miles west of us, because we would have had wind gusts in the 70s, and we would have had more substantial damage as well. So that's in terms of wind. Rainfall was not a huge issue. Storm surge was not awful, but obviously, Garden City, as some of you know, will flood if you spit. Even in the wintertime with nor'easters, you can get a lot of water piling into Garden City where there's a lot of low-lying areas anyway. But again, the storm surge 2 to 4, even 5 feet in a few locations in Garden City caused problems at high tide. Particularly hard hit with this hurricane was the north end, up near Little River and Cherry Grove. And I say they were hard hit because they were a little bit closer to the maximum storm surge. So there were a lot of areas that were inundated almost as much as Hurricane Matthew was. All right, some more of the storm surge flooding associated with Hurricane Isaias. And it's never a good thing when you have salt water coming into your pool right by the beaches, but you can see how close the ocean was and how big the waves were, that it was very easy to get that water to breach the dunes and make it into not only the pools, but underneath some of the homes out there as well. And storm surge has the potential to kill the most people simply because it is such a powerful force. But as I mentioned, people do a pretty good job of getting away from the coast, especially when there's a big hurricane coming. Hurricane Laura earlier this year was a Category 4 on the verge of becoming a Category 5 that slammed into southwestern Louisiana with nearly 150 mile per hour winds. It's by far the biggest hit we've taken so far along the United States coastline during this hurricane season, and very much like what you saw with Hurricane Michael in 2018. parts of the Louisiana coast were obliterated by not only the high wind, but the storm surge as well. This particular part of the Louisiana coastline is not nearly as populated as Mexico Beach and Panama City Beach are. So not nearly as many homes were destroyed, nor as many people impacted, because it's such a rural area compared to the Florida Panhandle. But still, you can see what a major hurricane coming ashore can do to the immediate coastline. It's almost like a buzzsaw coming through and destroying almost everything in its path. So here's where we stand right now. The forecast for this year was for 24 named storms, 12 hurricanes, and 5 major hurricanes, about as active a forecast as I've ever seen. They were calling for a hyperactive season, and those forecasts have been spot on. So far, 25 named storms, 9 hurricanes, 3 of those have become major. Major hurricane is one that is category 3 or higher. A normal season, or an average over the past 30 years, has been 12, 6, and 3. So it's been twice as active as normal. And the season's not over with yet. We could tack on another couple of named storms before the season actually ends, because it goes through the end of November. So far, it's not the busiest hurricane on season. A lot of you may remember 2005, when we had a grand total of 28 named storms. And you may not remember that real well because we weren't impacted very much at all. We had one tropical storm off our coast, Tropical Storm Ophelia, that impacted us, and that was it. We had no major hurricanes hitting our coastline. But Florida got hammered, so did the Gulf Coast. But again, we're in rarefied air here, being on the list since 1851. So far, this is the second busiest hurricane season on record. We do have a shot at least tying that record, perhaps even beating it. We'll see see how things go. Sorry, I'm not speaking clearly as we head through the rest of the hurricane season there. As I always say, you can have all the named storms in the world, but it only matters if you get hit. Unfortunately, we've been hit a lot this year in the United States. In fact, we've had 10 named storms actually make landfall in the continental U.S. Since 1851, that is the record. 2020, the old record was 9 named storms hitting the coastline in 1916. And again, this is through October 12th. It's conceivable we could have another landfalling tropical system over the next 3 or 4 weeks. We'll see. As you get into November, the chances of the U.S. being hit by a hurricane are extremely low because we're transitioning into winter months. So we'll see. There's some indication there could be another system that will develop in the Western Caribbean Sea as we head toward the latter part of October. And, until it develops, we have no idea if that goes into the Gulf of Mexico or goes across Cuba and eventually goes on out to sea. So these are the locations of all 10 of the U.S. landfalls. Obviously, Isaias was one. We actually had Bertha make landfall in South Carolina, but it was a minimal tropical storm, didn't even produce high wind, just some rainfall for us, so you may not even remember that. The Gulf Coast has been particularly hard hit, as you can see. I'll take you in a little bit closer here. And 7 of the 10 named storms that have formed this year have hit the northern Gulf. In particular, Louisiana has been hit 4 times. 2 hurricanes and 2 tropical storms have actually hit the Louisiana coast. And people will often ask, is there some sort of a pattern that always makes it that these locations are going to get hit? Not necessarily. There are times, though, we can go several months in a row where the pattern doesn't change very much. And if the pattern doesn't change and you get tropical storms and hurricanes to form, obviously they can impact similar locations. And that's what we've seen this year. High pressure out near Bermuda has been directing a lot of the activity into the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm sorry if you can hear a lot of loud noise. They're actually cutting the lawn across the lake. Hopefully that's not interfering with you hearing me. But anyway, here we are. We made it to the end of the standard alphabet. We don't use Q, U, X, Y, and Z. Meteorologists with the World Meteorological Organization felt that because we retire names once storms have produced a lot of damage or killed people, we would eventually not have enough names to use letters like Q, U, X, Y, and Z. So they're just not simply used. So 21 named storms in the standard alphabet. And here we are, 4 letters deep in the Greek alphabet. And we'll see how far we get. For us to exhaust the Greek alphabet, we'd have to have a total between the standard and Greek alphabet of, I think, 45 named storms. On the planet, that's never happened in one season. The highest ever is out in the western Pacific Ocean. The typhoons there, they have twice as many tropical systems every year compared to what we have. And they've only made it to 38. So we're never going to get to 45 in our lifetimes in any particular season. So we'll never run out of the Greek alphabet is what I'm trying to say. But we'll see if we add epsilon, zeta, and eta, theta as we head through time here. out there right now, we have one disturbance. The odds of this developing now are actually down to 20%. And the reason that it's very unlikely to develop is it's going to run into a ton of wind shear here very soon. So elsewhere in the tropics, things are quiet right now. We'll see what happens if anything develops out here in the Western Caribbean as we head through the next 7 to 10 days or so. So the month of October in South Carolina is usually pretty good to us here along the South Carolina coast. And 69 years, I think it is. Don't quote me on my math. Since 1851, we've only had 4 hurricanes directly impact the South Carolina coast. Of course, Matthew in 2016. A lot of you that have been around a while may remember Hurricane Hazel, 1954, a Category 4 that slammed into the South Carolina coast, destroying 90% of all oceanfront property from Little River all the way down to Pawleys Island. That really is the benchmark hurricane for the Grand Strand, more so than Hurricane Hugo because of how powerful it was and where it actually hit in Little River. The latest a hurricane has ever hit us was, believe it or not, on Halloween of 1899. A Category 2 actually slammed into Garden City with 105-mile-per-hour winds. And by the way, today is the anniversary of the 1893 Category 30 hurricane that actually made landfall down near Charleston, but it was still a hurricane when it came through our area. So again, October is pretty kind to us. We'd be very hard-pressed for the rest of the season to see a direct hit, and you need to knock on wood with that. Because of the pattern we're in right now, we're getting these cold fronts to come through every 4 or 5 days that are cooling us down. Those troughs swinging through have a tendency to push any tropical systems out to sea before they ever get here. That's not out of the question. You have one that's just off our coast that produces rain and wind as it's paralleling the coast, but a direct hit like one of these 4 is very, very unlikely as we head through the second half of October. And we've never had a tropical storm or hurricane hit the South Carolina coast in the month of November since 1851. And again, you need to knock on wood for that. So here we are. Today's October 13th. Only 3 hurricanes have made landfall along our coast after this date. We are well past the peak of the season, which is on September 10th. The primary reason that we've had such a active season is we're not in an El Nino. In an El Nino, warm waters off the South American coast create strong southwesterly winds, which is a lot of wind shear, which decreases hurricane activity. This year, we've been in what we call a La Nina, and that's the cooler than normal waters off the South American coast. And that generally means very light wind shear across much of the Atlantic and the Caribbean. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. And that allows tropical storms and hurricanes to form. You can have all the warm water in the world, but if you have strong wind shear, hurricanes simply can't form in that. So wind shear is one of the biggest factors when it comes to how active a hurricane season will be. And that La Nina made for very light wind shear across much of the Atlantic for much of the hurricane season. In addition to that, we've had very warm waters as well during the middle of the season. This says today, but this was actually in mid-September. Almost the entire Atlantic was warmer than normal. And even 1 degree is a lot of extra fuel for any tropical storm or hurricane. And that includes anything from the African coast through the Lesser Antilles and, of course, into the subtropical Atlantic as well. Well, we've had quite a few systems this year form there. Good that they form here because typically if they form here, they are moving on out to sea. It's the ones that develop down and through here that we have to worry about the most because they're obviously in the process of recurving by the time they get here. So during the peak of hurricane season, I know we're past that. It's always so important to be vigilant. I've only got a couple of more slides. There's only been 4 Category 5 hurricanes hit the United States coastline since 1851, or actually since 1900. And the bottom line, they were all tropical storms only 3 days before they made landfall. So 3 days ago, something was a tropical storm. 3 days later, it's a Category 5 coming ashore. And that's why it's so important to be vigilant and make sure no matter what a forecast is, that you're checking things out. Laura, Sally, even Delta, all rapidly intensified more than the forecast we're expecting. So when it comes to preparation, we always tell people, prepare for at least 1 category higher that's one being forecast to accommodate for any surprises that there may be in the actual forecast itself. And the last point I'll make here is, never sleep on a Category 1 hurricane. Never let your guard down in a Category 1. They are still devastating. Since 2010, we've had 175 deaths in the United States and $103 billion in damage. Remember, the categories of a storm are based on the wind speed. That doesn't say anything about how much rain or how big the storm surge will be. So always remember that. Focus on the hazards, not necessarily the category. And we're always going to describe to you the hazards that we're expecting and what that means to you. All right, last two things. How about flying through the eye of a hurricane? This is what it looks like from a hurricane hunter. There's the eye. You fly through the clouds and then you bust into the eye. And this is the actual eye wall itself, this tall area of white you see here that basically covers or circles the entire eye. The eye is right here in blue. And in the center of a hurricane, the air is actually sinking. And so when the air sinks, it doesn't create clouds. So it clears out very nicely in a hurricane. But that's what it looks like inside. Let me go and do that again so you can see that. This is the hurricane hunter, obviously. Thick clouds. Then when it breaks through the eye wall, it breaks into the eye itself. And there it is, crystal clear. That eye wall with Hurricane Michael, I think, was about 20 miles wide, to give you a little idea. And these hurricane hunters do a tremendous job gathering incredibly valuable information to make the forecast so much better. Anytime you can reduce a hurricane watch or a warning by 1 mile, it saves that part of the coastline $1 million in preparation. So they are worth their weight in gold for the information they give us and the improved forecast that we can actually get. So this is what it looks like from the cockpit of an actual hurricane hunter. It is tremendously bumpy, obviously. It's a lot of turbulence within a hurricane's eye wall, but it's very safe. We've been flying in hurricanes. They have been flying in hurricanes really since the 1940s. And to my knowledge, only one hurricane hunter has been lost, and that was in the Caribbean, I believe back in the 1940s. So it's been a long time and very, very safe. Bottom line, every year it's important to be prepared. Perfect example, 1992, we had only 7 named storms. That was the year Hurricane Andrew slammed into South Florida as a Category 5 hurricane. Of course, this year we've had 25 named storms, and Isaias was the only one that has hit us, and it wasn't a horrible hurricane. So we've been extremely lucky when it came to that. All right, so that's where I am now. Let me go ahead and put you guys back up full screen. Hopefully this is going to work. There we go.
And we'll give an opportunity for anyone who is watching to type in a question. I think we've got some.
We had one that came over the phone. They wanted to know a little bit about who is in charge of the.
I'm so not used to doing presentations on Zoom, so I mean, I'd much rather see faces. So hopefully it went fine.
It went very well, Ed. Thank you very much. Yeah, we're all learning together in our creativity and flexibility. Appreciate you being willing to do it this way. From your
Amen.
Front porch, your back porch.
This is my back porch, and this is my view from my back porch. So it's pretty nice.
Very nice. Thanks for sharing the personal side as well. We appreciate that. One question has been asked, and that is, who is responsible for the predictions, the monitoring? Which is a federal agency, or who is responsible for that?
Okay, it's actually a combination of several different organizations. There are several different private and government organizations that actually will do the seasonal forecast. Dr. Phil Klotzbach, who works with Colorado State University, has been making these seasonal forecasts prior to the hurricane season for many, many years. They're really the authority on it, and he's the one that I always quote when it comes to the hurricane seasonal forecast. He's the one that forecasts 24 named storms. And what they do is they look at past years. There's a lot of hindcasting done where you look at various setups in the atmosphere and compare them to what we have today. And we're thinking, okay, in April, we've had this sort of a setup. Well, in April and these years, we had the same setup, and this is how many hurricanes actually form. So that's what I mean about things can kind of repeat themselves. And everything just came together for an active season. NOAA makes a forecast as well. Now, when it comes to the actual storm, a depression, storm, hurricane, and who tracks those, that is solely and exclusively done by the National Hurricane Center. You only want one voice doing that so that there's no, I can't think of the word offhand. There's basically no discrepancies in forecast, and there's no way that people can get different information and think that it's something else. I totally had a brain aneurysm there, but you get the idea.
And it is interesting that it's somebody from Colorado who is doing this for us.
Right. And yeah, that's the beauty of technology anymore. You can virtually be anywhere in the world when you think about it. We don't want confusion in the forecast. That's what I'm saying. We don't want people getting different forecasts and being confused about what's going to happen. That's what I was trying to say.
Thank you, Ed. We got it.
Okay.
They want to know all the storms he's covered. Which one made him the most worried?
Okay. Another question has come in. Of all the storms that you've covered in your 26 years at the station, which is the one that had you most concerned?
There are actually two. A lot of you may remember Hurricane Floyd back in 1999. Hurricane Floyd was a Category 5 hurricane near the Bahamas. And, back in 1999, the forecasts weren't as good as they were or they are today. So that forecast was for a direct hit into Georgetown and Murrells Inlet just 2 days out. And so we thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be a catastrophic hit to the Grand Strand on par with Hurricane Hazel and Hurricane Hugo. Well, the forecasts were not perfect, and Hurricane Floyd lost a lot of its intensity. It came ashore as a Category 2, and instead of hitting Murrells Inlet, it actually went in near Wilmington. We had a lot of flooding, and some of the flooding was record-setting at the time, but compared to what we thought could happen 2 days prior to that, that was the most fearful I've been. Florence was pretty scary as well because remember Hurricane Florence in the middle of the Atlantic was a Category 5 or near a Category 5. It was forecast to come into the North Carolina coast as a Category 3 or 4. Well, that too had weakened considerably before landfall and came ashore as a Category 1 or 2 hurricane near Wrightsville Beach and then weakened as it came over our area. So, one of the things we always tell people, there's a 5-day forecast out there, and it's going to change considerably, but you've always got to prepare for the worst and hope for the very best. If you're still in the cone within 3 days, that's when you need to start making all your preparations, and that way, if you're still going to be directly hit day 1 or 2, you're totally ready. So I'd say Floyd and Florence, those two F storms, were the two I was most concerned with.
Another question has come in, which I was waiting to hear. Has global climate change made a direct impact on the number and severity of storms that we're experiencing?
That's a great question. And, the big debate more than anything else is who's causing the warming. We're not going to get into that debate. There's no doubt in my mind, based on everything I've seen, that the globe is warming. And most of that warming goes into the ocean. 3/4 of the planet is covered with water, and a lot of that goes into the ocean. So if the oceans are warming, then it makes sense that you have more fuel for hurricanes. But a lot of the long-range forecast models are indicating that if the globe were to continue to warm, that wind shear would actually increase, and we would see a decrease in the overall numbers of tropical storms and hurricanes that form. But those that did form, they would have the potential to be about 10% stronger than they are now. We would see categories 4s and 5s a bit more frequently. Maybe not as much as a lot of people think, but still, if you're increasing the more powerful hurricanes and those come ashore, they're going to cause more damage overall. And you really can't look at the last 2 or 3 years. Anything involved with climate is based on a minimum of at least 30 years of averages. So when you hear people say this particular hurricane in this particular year is because of climate change, that's just wrong. It has to be what you see over the course of at least 30 years. And there's no doubt we've seen an uptick overall in tropical storms and hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean, but that's not necessarily related to just climate change. We have what we call the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, where the Atlantic for a period of 30 to 40 years will go through periods of very active hurricanes seasons and very non-active hurricane seasons. So there's much more at play than just climate change. And quite frankly, when you look at the globe as a whole, there has been no change in the numbers of tropical storms and hurricanes that have formed globally. And there are some studies out there that show, and this is the last point I'll make, that there's been an uptick in tropical storms and hurricanes globally. The reason that's been kind of discounted is because before 1960, there was no satellites. So there were tropical storms that formed over the Atlantic Ocean that we had no idea formed out there. So when NOAA scientists go back and look at those seasons, they think that you've got to add 2 or 3 storms to each season prior to 1960 to have a reasonable idea of how many formed, simply because many were missed in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean prior to satellites. One thing, and can I add one thing? The one thing with climate change that you've got to look out for with tropical systems is this. When the globe is warming, the jet stream actually slows down, and because of that, hurricanes have a tendency to move slower, like the Matthews and the Hurricane Florences. So when you have slower moving tropical systems, they are going to produce a lot more rainfall. And that's what we're concerned about the most as we move forward, are slower moving tropical systems that may produce more catastrophic rainfall events. It doesn't make these rain events produce these rain events, it makes rain events worse. That's probably the best way to put it. Instead of getting 20 inches of rain, you may get 25 inches of rain. That can make a big difference in flooding.
Obviously, people who have lived here for some time talk about Hugo and its impact on our area. And the implications are that that's been the worst. But you're saying that Hazel had even a greater impact? And is it simply our memory and the length of time we've been alive?
Right.
I ironically lived in Pennsylvania, and I can remember Hazel coming through Pennsylvania in 1954.
Yes, you're right about that. I probably need to clarify that. It really depends on what part of the Grand Strand you're on. You know, from Garden City southward to Georgetown, through Pawleys Island, through Georgetown, Hugo was probably a worse hit with the storm surge because the eye of Hurricane Hugo came ashore near McClellanville, or just south of there in Bulls Bay, and produced a 25-foot storm surge, or 20-foot storm surge. And it was more than 13 feet in Myrtle Beach and also in Garden City. It was about 15 feet. And there was a tremendous amount of damage done there. For Myrtle Beach proper up toward Little River, Hugo was bad, but Hazel was actually first for those locations. Hazel probably was not as bad for Pawleys Island and Georgetown, but you got to remember in 1954, there wasn't nearly as much stuff built up along the Grand Strand as there was in 1989 and as what there is today.
Very good. Do we have any other questions? I think that's it. Ed, thank you so much for all the great insights. I learned that there are well-behaved hurricanes.
Yes. Those that brush our coast are the best ones that are moving fast.
Well, we thank you for being creative and flexible and sharing your front porch with us or your back porch with us and being able to be with us today. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you guys very much. I appreciate it. Hopefully, if we do this again next year, we'll be able to do it in person.
Okay. It's a deal. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, guys. Take care. Okay. Bye-bye.
And we want to thank all of you for joining with us today. This has been a good experience. We're in the auditorium. I feel like I'm in the Masterpiece Theater seat here as I welcome you and speak with you. But it's been, as I say, a year in which we're doing creative kinds of things, continuing our series in various ways, our activities as the Friends of the Georgetown Library. We have a regular schedule now of Tuesdays With that will continue. In November, we will be having William Connor speak, who's professor and assistant director of the Brooke Institute of Coastal Ecology and Forest Science at Clemson University, and he'll be speaking on bald cypress, the wood eternal. And I know that'll be an excellent presentation. Once again, it'll be virtual like this, broadcast online, so that all of us can enjoy it together. That'll be Tuesday, November 17th. Also, we've had to cancel, unfortunately, our big fall and spring book sales here at the library, unable to do that. But what we've been doing, again, as a creative alternative, is having a book sale at our community farmers market here in Georgetown every Saturday from 8 a.m. to 1 o'clock. And we encourage you to come join us and pick up some nice books, good deals, $1 for hardback and 50 cents for paperbacks. And we're there Saturday, the next two Saturdays, the 17th and the 24th, as we continue and complete, actually, the farmers market downtown Georgetown this fall. And also for a future event, I want to mention our December Tuesdays With will be with Gloria Barr Ford, Georgetown storyteller, dramatist, and singer, who will be speaking on A Gullah Christmas. We're looking forward to that. Again, I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank Heather Pelham and Truman Wynn for the technology and backing up here for us in our creative approach to our Tuesdays With, and hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to be on our email list and get information, we're sending out weekly updates of various resources that the Georgetown Library has been providing. Just email me at rwilley, W-I-L-L-E-Y, 1019 at gmail.com. Thanks very much, and until, let's see, will be November. We'll be back together again. With much thanks to Ed for joining us today. Thank you so much. Goodbye.